There was a role assigned to you long before you ever agreed to play it. Nobody sat you down and asked whether you wanted the part. It was simply handed to you in the quiet architecture of the relationship, in the small transactions of attention and withdrawal that taught you, piece by piece, what your place was. You were the one who reached, the one who called first, who softened first, who found the words to close the distance when distance opened up. And somewhere along the way, this became so familiar that it stopped looking like a pattern and started looking like your personality. You told yourself, I'm just the kind of person who doesn't give up on people. But underneath that story was something far less romantic and far more revealing. You had been cast, and you had accepted the role because the alternative, being the one who was left, who was not reached for, felt unbearable. This is the part we rarely stop to examine. We assume that pursuit is proof of love, that the one who chases is simply more devoted, more invested, more willing. But when we look closer, when we ask what is actually happening physiologically and emotionally in the body of the person doing the chasing, we find something else. We find a nervous system that has learned, often very early in life, that love is not something freely given. It is something that must be earned, monitored, maintained through vigilance. For many of you listening, this didn't begin in that relationship. It began years earlier, in a childhood where affection was inconsistent, where a parent's warmth depended on your performance, your mood, your ability to not be too much or too little. You learned that connection required labor, and so as an adult, when you encountered someone who was emotionally inconsistent, warm then distant, present then gone, your body didn't recoil. It recognized something. It felt, in a strange and painful way, like home. This is what the other person relied on, whether they understood it consciously or not. Your willingness to close the gap meant they never had to. They could retreat and trust that you would follow. They could stay silent and trust that you would break the silence. They could offer just enough, a message at the right moment, a flicker of warmth after days of nothing, to keep the system running, without ever having to risk the vulnerability of reaching first. And here is the uncomfortable truth. This wasn't malicious, not usually. It was simply easier. It is always easier to be chosen than to choose. It is always safer to be pursued than to risk pursuing and being refused. So they let you run the relationship's emotional economy because you were willing to, and because somewhere in them, they too were protecting an old wound, a fear of rejection so deep that receiving your effort felt safer than ever having to offer their own. But notice what this arrangement cost you. Every time you initiated, you were casting a small vote that said, I will provide the stability neither of us can find within ourselves. Every unanswered message you followed up on, every distance you closed, was a rehearsal of an old belief, that love only stays if you work hard enough to keep it. This is not weakness. I want to be very clear about that, because so many of you have spent years calling yourselves too much, too needy, too eager. You were not too much. You were a person whose early environment taught them that safety requires vigilance, and who then, quite understandably, brought that vigilance into every bond that mattered. The chasing was never really about them. It was about an old, unmet need for a love that didn't require constant proof. So before we talk about what changed, and something did change, I want you to sit with this first insight, because everything after it depends on you actually understanding it. You were not simply in love with a person. You were in a relationship with a role that let someone else stay safe while you carried all the risk. And the moment you begin to see that clearly, without shame, without blame, is the moment the role starts to lose its grip on you. Because you cannot unconsciously repeat a pattern once you have consciously named it. Naming it is the first act of freedom. Now let's go deeper into why this pattern felt like love in the first place. Because understanding the role is only the beginning. The harder question, the one that requires real honesty, is why chasing someone who kept pulling away didn't feel like torment to you. It felt, at least in part, like intensity, like passion, like proof that you cared more than anyone ever had. And this is where we have to talk about the nervous system. Because what I am describing is not simply a matter of poor choices or low self-esteem. It is a matter of biology shaped by history. When a child grows up in an environment where love is unpredictable, where a caregiver is warm one moment and withdrawn the next, present sometimes and emotionally absent other times, that child's attachment system doesn't simply give up on connection. It adapts. It becomes hyper-attuned to the smallest shifts in another person's mood, because reading those shifts accurately was once a matter of survival. If you could sense the exact moment your parent's affection was about to disappear, you could brace for it, perhaps even prevent it. And so the nervous system builds a kind of radar, always scanning, always alert to the possibility of loss. This radar doesn't switch off in adulthood. It simply finds a new target. And when that target is a person who is emotionally inconsistent, the very same radar that once kept you safe as a child now floods your body with adrenaline, with cortisol, with the unmistakable physical sensation we interpret as passion. This is the part almost no one tells you. Anxiety and attraction can feel identical in the body. A racing heart, a tightening chest, a mind that cannot stop returning to the same person. We call this falling in love, but physiologically, it is often the stress response. It is the body trying to resolve an unresolved threat and mistaking the unresolved nature of the relationship for depth of feeling. The very inconsistency that should have been a warning sign becomes, instead, the fuel. Because uncertainty keeps the nervous system activated, and an activated nervous system feels, to someone who grew up starved of steady affection, like something is finally happening. Calm, ironically, can feel suspicious. Stability can feel boring, even untrustworthy, because it doesn't match the template the body learned to associate with love. This is why so many people find themselves bored by those who are kind, consistent, and available, while remaining magnetically drawn to those who are unpredictable. It is not a character flaw. It is a nervous system doing exactly what it was trained to do, seeking the familiar, even when the familiar is painful. Gabor Maté has spent much of his life pointing to this exact truth. The conditions of our early attachment don't just shape our psychology, they shape our physiology, our stress hormones, even our immune responses. We are not choosing dysfunction because we enjoy suffering. We are choosing what our bodies recognize. And what the body recognizes, it often mistakes for what the heart desires. So when you look back at yourself running after someone who kept creating distance, I want you to release the judgment you've been carrying. You were not foolish. You were not desperate. You were a nervous system responding exactly as it had been shaped to respond, chasing a felt sense of aliveness that had, since childhood, been inseparable from anxiety. The chase felt like love because, for you, love had never been separable from uncertainty. Nobody teaches us this in school. Nobody sits us down and explains that the same biological machinery that kept us safe as children can, decades later, quietly sabotage the very peace we are searching for as adults. We are left to discover it alone, usually in the wreckage of a relationship that took more from us than it ever gave back. But here is where the philosophical weight of this moment lands. To understand the origin of a pattern is not to be condemned to repeat it. Awareness interrupts automaticity. The moment you can name what your body is doing, this is not love, this is the old alarm system firing again, you create a sliver of space between stimulus and response, and in that sliver, for the first time, you get to choose, not react. Choose. This is not weakness, rewriting itself into strength through willpower alone. It is understanding, slowly, patiently, teaching the nervous system a new definition of safety, one that does not require chaos to feel real. And once that shift begins, even quietly, even privately, nothing about how you love again will ever look the same. Now let's turn the lens toward the other person, because understanding your own nervous system is only half the picture. To fully grasp why this dynamic sustained itself for as long as it did, we have to ask an uncomfortable question. What did they get from being the one who was chased? And the answer, once you see it clearly, reframes everything. Being pursued is, for many people, one of the safest positions a person can occupy in a relationship. Think about what it requires of them. Almost nothing. They do not have to risk rejection because they are never the one reaching out first. They do not have to sit with the vulnerability of wondering, will this person still want me tomorrow? Because your consistent effort already answers that question for them, over and over, without them ever having to ask it aloud. Being chosen to chase means being handed all the reassurance of love without any of its exposure. And for someone whose own attachment history taught them that vulnerability is dangerous, that reaching for someone and being met with rejection is a wound almost too painful to survive, this arrangement is not laziness. It is self-protection, dressed up as detachment. This is where mate's understanding of trauma becomes essential, because we tend to think of the pursuer as the wounded one, and the pursued as somehow untouched, even powerful. But often the opposite is true. The person who avoids reaching out, who lets someone else carry the emotional weight of the relationship, is frequently protecting an old injury of their own, a childhood where their own needs were dismissed, where expressing want led to shame, or where a caregiver's love came with conditions so unpredictable that the safest strategy became to want nothing, to need nothing, to appear entirely self-sufficient. If you never reach for anyone, you can never be the one who is left reaching into empty air. Their withdrawal was never proof that they didn't feel anything. Often it was proof that they felt too much and had long ago decided that feeling too much was not survivable without armor. So when you were chasing, you were not simply feeding your own unmet need for stability. You were also, without realizing it, absorbing the emotional labor they refused to carry themselves. Every reassurance you offered, every gentle check-in after their silence, was doing double duty, soothing your own anxious system while simultaneously letting them stay hidden behind a wall they had built long before you arrived. This is the quiet exchange at the center of so many unbalanced relationships. One person performs all the vulnerability, so the other person never has to risk any of their own. And because your effort was so visible, so constant, it created the illusion of a relationship that was working, when in truth, only one nervous system was doing all the reaching, all the risking, all the emotional exposure. This is not a story of villain and victim. That framing, however satisfying it might feel in the moment, misses the deeper truth. Both of you are operating from old blueprints, drawn together by a kind of unconscious recognition. Your hypervigilance found its perfect counterpart in their avoidance, and their avoidance found its perfect counterpart in your pursuit. Two survival strategies, shaped by two different histories, locking together with an almost mechanical precision. This is why these dynamics can feel so intensely magnetic, even when they are clearly unhealthy. You are not simply attracted to a person. You are attracted to a familiar shape, a pattern your nervous system had been rehearsing since childhood, and so was he, and so was she. The relationship wasn't broken by bad intentions. It was built on two forms of fear, wearing the costume of love. But here's what matters now, in this moment, as you sit with this understanding. Recognizing their side of the pattern is not an invitation to excuse it, and it is certainly not a reason to return to it. It is simply the final piece required for clarity, because as long as you believed their distance meant you weren't enough, you remained trapped in a story that kept you chasing, kept you performing, kept you trying to earn what was never actually about your worth in the first place. Once you understand that their withdrawal was never a referendum on your value, but rather a reflection of their own unhealed fear, the compulsion to prove yourself begins to lose its grip. You stop trying to unlock a door that was never yours to open. And in that release, something in you finally exhales, because you were never actually failing to be loved correctly. You were simply standing in front of a wall that had been built long before you ever knocked on it. And then, somewhere along the way, something shifted, not dramatically, not with an announcement, not with a decision made in a single decisive moment the way we imagine transformation should happen. It was quieter than that. It was smaller than that. It was a Tuesday, perhaps, when a message went unanswered and, for the first time in longer than you could remember, you didn't immediately reach for your phone to check it again. It was a silence that stretched a little longer than usual, and instead of filling it the way you always had, you simply let it sit there, unattended, unresolved, and you didn't even fully notice it happening. That is the strange nature of real change. It rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as exhaustion, as a passing thought, as a moment too small to register as significant, and only later, looking back, do you understand that this was the beginning of everything. This is important to understand, because we tend to romanticize transformation. We imagine it as a lightning bolt, a single cinematic realization that changes a person forever. But in the body, in the nervous system, healing rarely works that way. It accumulates. It happens in the space between one more attempt and the moment you simply do not have the reach left in you that day. Mate would tell you that the body keeps score long before the mind catches up, and this is precisely what was happening. Your system had been running on high alert for so long, scanning, anticipating, chasing, that eventually, without your permission, it began to conserve itself. Not because you decided to be strong, not because you read the right book or heard the right piece of advice, but because a nervous system can only sustain a state of vigilance for so long before something in it begins, quietly, to protect itself from further depletion. This is the part that so many people misunderstand about detachment. They think it must be willed into existence, that you have to force yourself to stop caring, grit your teeth, and refuse to reach out as an act of discipline. But real detachment, the kind that lasts, doesn't usually begin as a decision at all. It begins as depletion that finally outweighs the old compulsion. The chasing had cost you something for a long time: sleep, peace, self-respect, the quiet erosion of your own sense of worth. And eventually, the cost became too visible to ignore. Not because you suddenly loved yourself more, though that mattered too, but because your body, in its own wisdom, had simply run out of the fuel that pursuit requires. You didn't stop chasing because you stopped caring. You stopped chasing because some deeper part of you finally understood that caring this much, in this direction, was no longer survivable. And this is where the philosophical weight of the moment reveals itself. Because what looks from the outside like indifference is often, underneath, the most honest form of self-respect a person can offer themselves. Existentialist thinkers have long argued that freedom is found not in grand gestures, but in the accumulation of small refusals, the moments where we choose not to repeat an old pattern, even quietly, even without witnesses. Your silence that day was one of those refusals. You were not punishing them. You were not performing strategy. You were simply, for the first time in a long while, listening to what your own exhaustion was trying to tell you, instead of overriding it the way you always had. This is the crack that changes everything, and it is worth naming precisely because it so often goes unnoticed even by the person living through it. One evening you didn't call. One morning you didn't explain yourself. One silence you let remain a silence. And nothing dramatic happened in that moment. No confrontation, no confession, no visible shift in the relationship at all. But internally, something had already begun to reorganize. The old radar was still there, but its signal had weakened, just slightly, just enough. And that slight weakening was enough to change the entire trajectory of what came next, because for the first time, the space you always used to fill was left empty. And empty space, as you are about to discover, has a way of revealing exactly who was standing on solid ground, and who had only ever been standing on you. This is the moment the title of this speech has been pointing toward from the very beginning. This is what you did, not a scheme, not a strategy borrowed from some manual on how to make someone want you more. What you did was far simpler and far more radical than any tactic could ever be. You stopped. You stopped initiating. You stopped explaining yourself in message after message, trying to translate your worth into paragraphs someone else could have simply chosen to read with their own eyes, if they had ever truly wanted to. You stopped auditioning for a place in someone's life that should have been freely offered, not earned through relentless proof. And you let the space that used to be filled with your effort remain, for the first time, completely empty. I want to be precise about what this was, because it is so often misunderstood, even by the people who live through it. This was not manipulation. It was not a calculated silence designed to provoke a reaction, though I know that from the outside, or even from their perspective, it may have looked exactly like that. What actually happened was far more honest. You simply stopped performing a role that had never been sustainable in the first place. You stopped translating your love into constant labor, because some part of you had finally recognized that love which requires perpetual proof is not love at all. It is negotiation, dressed in more comfortable clothing. And when you stopped negotiating, you weren't punishing them. You were, for the first time in longer than you can probably remember, simply telling the truth with your actions instead of your words. There is something almost unbearably vulnerable about this kind of stillness, and I don't want to minimize how difficult it actually was. Every cell in your nervous system, shaped by years of vigilance, was likely screaming at you to reach out, to fix it, to close the gap the way you always had. Letting silence remain silence, when your entire body has been trained to interpret silence as danger, is one of the hardest things a person can do. This is not passive. Do not let anyone tell you that detachment is passive. It requires an active, moment-to-moment refusal to override your own exhaustion with old habit. It requires sitting inside discomfort without resolving it the way you always have. And that, psychologically speaking, is an act of considerable courage. perhaps more courage than the chasing ever required, because the chasing at least gave you something to do with your anxiety. Stillness gives you nothing but yourself. And this is precisely where the philosophical center of this speech lives, because what you were doing in that stillness was no longer organizing your worth around another person's willingness to reciprocate. You were, whether you had language for it or not, reclaiming authorship over your own life. Existential thinkers have long argued that we become most free not when we control others, but when we stop outsourcing our sense of self to people who were never equipped to hold it responsibly. Letting the space stay empty was not about them at all. Not really. It was about you finally refusing to abandon yourself in the hope that someone else might notice you were gone. This is also the moment where the two nervous systems we discussed earlier, yours, hyper-attuned and exhausted from constant vigilance, and theirs, protected behind a wall of avoidance, finally stopped locking together in their old familiar dance. Because their entire strategy depended on your predictability. It depended on knowing that no matter how far they withdrew, you would eventually close the distance. When you stopped closing it, you weren't just changing your own behavior. You were removing the one variable their entire emotional safety had been quietly built upon. I want you to sit with something here, because it matters more than anything else in this speech. What you did was not designed to make them chase you. If it had been, it would have failed, because manipulation dressed as detachment always collapses the moment the other person senses the strategy underneath it. What actually worked, if we can even call it that, is that you stopped performing altogether. You became, for the first time, unavailable to a dynamic that had been built entirely on your availability. And whether or not they ever noticed, whether or not they ever reached back, you had already won something far more important than their attention. You had won yourself back. That is the real turning point. Not what happens next in their story, what finally happened in yours. Now let's look at what happened on their side, because something did happen, even if it took time to surface. For as long as the relationship had existed, they had operated within a system they never had to consciously examine. Your pursuit was the constant. It was the background music of their emotional life, so reliable that they never had to think about it, the way you never think about the floor beneath your feet until, one day, it simply isn't there. And when your energy changed, when the messages stopped coming, when the silence you left was no longer interrupted by your usual reaching, the first thing that surfaced in them was not grief. It was confusion. Confusion is often the first response to a broken pattern, because the mind, when confronted with something unfamiliar, doesn't immediately reach for meaning. It reaches for explanation. They likely told themselves a dozen small stories to make sense of your absence. You were busy, you were tired, you were testing them. This was temporary. This would resolve itself the way it always had before. This is a very human response. The mind resists updating its model of reality, even when the evidence is right in front of it, because updating that model requires confronting something far more threatening than your silence. It requires confronting the possibility that the safety they had built their entire relational strategy around was never guaranteed. It was simply something you had been giving them, freely, for as long as you were willing to. And so often, what comes next is a kind of testing. A message sent at an unusual hour. A comment dropped into a conversation that seems casual but is really an attempt to gauge whether the old pattern still holds. This is not necessarily conscious manipulation, though sometimes it is. More often, it is the nervous system doing exactly what yours used to do, reaching out, tentatively, to check whether the ground is still there. And when it isn't, when your response doesn't arrive at the same speed, the same warmth, the same eagerness to close the gap, something in them begins to register what confusion eventually becomes: apprehension. And apprehension, if the silence continues, deepens further still into something closer to real fear. This is worth sitting with because it reveals something profound about the architecture of avoidant attachment. The person who withdraws is not actually indifferent to connection. If they were truly indifferent, your absence would register as nothing at all. But it doesn't register as nothing. It registers as loss, often for the first time, because your consistent presence had been functioning as a kind of external regulation for their own nervous system. Proof, whether they admitted it to themselves or not, that they were still wanted, still worth reaching for, even though they had never had to do the reaching themselves. When that proof disappears, the wall they built to protect themselves from vulnerability suddenly stops protecting them from anything. It simply isolates them. In a silence they now have to sit inside without you there to interrupt it for them. Here is where Mate's understanding of defense mechanisms becomes so clarifying. Avoidance was never actually strength. It was armor built around an old wound, and armor, by its very nature, only works when it is never truly tested. Your withdrawal was the test, and for perhaps the first time in the relationship, they were forced to feel the very thing their entire strategy had been designed to avoid. The anxiety of not knowing whether they were still chosen, still wanted, still safe in someone else's eyes. This is not something you did to them, and I want to be careful here, because there is a difference between consequence and cruelty. You did not orchestrate their fear. You simply stopped absorbing it for them, and in the space that created, they were finally left alone with a feeling they had spent years, perhaps a lifetime, structuring their whole personality to avoid. Whether this fear eventually pushed them to reach back toward you, or whether it simply confirmed for them that retreat was safer, is, in the end, not the part of this story that matters most. What matters is what their reaction reveals about the truth of the entire dynamic. That your presence had never been something they were entitled to. It had been a gift, offered freely, for far longer than it was ever reciprocated. And once a person finally understands the difference between being given something and being owed something, they stop mistaking someone else's exhaustion for a problem they get to solve on their own terms. Their fear was never your responsibility to manage. It was, finally, only theirs to face. Now I want to bring you back to yourself because it would be easy, at this point in the story, to become fixated on their reaction, to measure the success of your stillness by whether it moved them, whether it frightened them, whether it eventually brought them closer. But if that is where your attention settles, you have missed the deeper truth this entire journey has been leading you toward. What happened in you was never a strategy to change them. It was evidence, quiet and undeniable, that something inside you had finally healed enough to stop abandoning yourself for someone else's comfort. This distinction matters more than almost anything else in this speech, so let's sit with it fully. If you stopped chasing purely to provoke a reaction, purely to see whether absence would succeed where presence had failed, then you were still, in essence, playing the same old game with a new set of rules. You would still be organizing your behavior around their response, still outsourcing your peace to whether or not it worked. That is not healing. That is strategy wearing the mask of growth, and the two are not the same thing, no matter how similar they can look from the outside. Real detachment doesn't ask whether it worked. It doesn't need an outcome to justify itself, because its value was never contingent on their return in the first place. What actually happened, if this truly was healing and not tactic, is something quieter and far more significant. Your nervous system, for the first time in a long while, began to regulate itself without requiring their participation. This is what Mate would call the difference between authenticity and attachment. The ability to remain connected to your own needs, your own worth, your own internal sense of safety, without requiring another person's behavior to confirm any of it. For most of the relationship, your peace had been conditional. It rose and fell with their warmth, their silence, their unpredictable availability. You were, in a very real sense, living inside someone else's nervous system instead of your own. And the moment you stopped chasing wasn't simply the absence of an old behavior. It was the return of a self that had been quietly on loan to someone else for far too long. This is where the philosophical weight of this moment becomes undeniable. To detach without needing an outcome, to release someone without requiring their absence to hurt them in order to feel meaningful, is one of the purest expressions of self-respect available to a human being. It says in effect, my peace does not depend on your response. My worth was never up for negotiation, and I am no longer willing to audition for a place that should have been mine simply by virtue of being who I am. This is not coldness. It is the opposite of coldness. It is what happens when a person finally stops performing love and starts practicing it, quietly, toward themselves, perhaps for the first time in years. I also want to address something many of you may still be carrying, even now, even after everything we've discussed. The fear that stopping the chase means you didn't love them enough, or that real love should never require boundaries, never require stillness, never require walking away from the reaching that once felt so instinctive. But love that requires you to abandon yourself is not love in its healthiest form. It is a repetition compulsion dressed in the language of devotion, True care for another person can never come at the total expense of care for yourself. And any framework that tells you otherwise is not describing love. It is describing dependency, however beautifully it may be disguised. So if nothing else lands from everything we've explored today, let this be the peace that stays with you. The peace you feel now, in the stillness, in the space you no longer feel compelled to fill, is not a symptom of having given up. It is proof of arrival. It means the old alarm system, the one that mistook chaos for love and inconsistency for passion, has finally, quietly, begun to fall silent. And that silence, unlike the silence you once feared, is not empty. It is the sound of a person who has finally stopped waiting for someone else's permission to feel whole. So let's widen the lens now, because everything we've explored up to this point, the role you were assigned, the nervous system that mistook anxiety for love, the wall they built to protect themselves, the quiet crack that changed everything, the stillness you finally chose, and their confusion that deepened into fear, all of it has been leading toward a single question. If you are no longer spending your life chasing someone else's love, what do you do with everything you get back? Because this is what almost nobody tells you about detachment. We talk endlessly about what it costs to let go, the grief, the discomfort, the nights spent resisting the urge to reach out one more time. But we rarely talk about what it returns to you, and the truth is, it returns almost everything. All that energy that used to be spent scanning someone else's mood, predicting their withdrawal, managing their emotional weather, that energy doesn't simply disappear once you stop chasing. It comes home. It becomes available again, for the first time in years, to be spent on your own life, your own healing, your own becoming. Think for a moment about what it actually costs to chase someone who does not chase back. It is not simply time. It is presence. It is the part of you that could have been noticing your own needs, tending to your own dreams, showing up fully in friendships and work, and the quiet, ordinary moments of your own existence. Instead, all of that attention was funneled toward monitoring someone else's availability. This is what Mate means when he speaks of the cost of disconnection from self, in service of connection to another. You cannot be fully present to your own life, while a significant portion of your nervous system is permanently stationed at someone else's door, waiting to see whether it will open. And so what opens, when you finally stop waiting, is not simply freedom from them. It is a return to yourself, and this return is where the real transformation lives. Self-respect, real self-respect, is not a feeling you conjure through affirmations. It is something that gets rebuilt, slowly, through the accumulation of moments where you choose yourself over the old compulsion to prove your worth to someone who is never going to see it clearly anyway. Every day you don't chase is a small deposit into a version of yourself that no longer needs external validation to feel whole. And eventually, almost without noticing, that version of you becomes who you actually are, rather than who you have to work to become each time the old pattern threatens to resurface. This is also where relationships themselves begin to change, not just the one you left behind, but every relationship that comes after it. Because once you have tasted a version of yourself that doesn't perform for love, you become far less willing to accept dynamics that require performance. Stillness becomes your new baseline, not because you've grown cold, but because you now recognize peace as something worth protecting. You start to notice, almost immediately, the difference between a connection that asks you to prove yourself and one that simply receives you as you are. And once you've felt that difference, you cannot easily unfeel it. This is not cynicism. It is discernment, earned the hard way, through the very pain this speech has spent so much time honoring. There is a philosophical truth underneath all of this, one that echoes across nearly every tradition of depth psychology and existential thought, that we cannot fully receive love from another person until we have stopped abandoning ourselves in pursuit of it. The chasing was never simply a flawed strategy for keeping someone close. It was, in its own tragic way, a barrier to the very intimacy you were seeking, because a person who is constantly performing worth cannot fully be seen. Only their performance can. When you stopped chasing, you didn't just change the dynamic with them. You made yourself available, finally, to a love that doesn't require a costume. So as we close, I want to leave you with this. The life that opens when you stop running is not a smaller life. It does not feel, despite what fear might tell you in the beginning, like loss. It feels, slowly and then all at once, like room to breathe, Like your own name spoken by your own voice, finally loud enough to hear over everyone else's noise. You were never meant to spend your one life proving you were worth staying for. You were only ever meant to live it, fully, as the person who was worth it all along. And the moment you believe that, truly believe it, is the moment nothing and no one can ever put you back in that chase again.